Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and today we're going to talk about the one missing ingredient that most low-carb influencers, doctors, nutritionists ignore, and it's just not a good thing, in my opinion. So I'm going to tell what it is that I don't ignore that most of them do. Not all, but most of them do ignore. Well, to start out with, let me just take you down memory lane. When I started Beat Diabetes, which was, as I recall, the beginning of 2017, January of 2017, there were not that many low-carb nutritionists and doctors and people on YouTube that talked about reversing diabetes. There were some. There weren't a whole lot, and some of the big names that you know today were actually small names back in those days. We were all struggling to kind of carve our niche in this field of beating diabetes through a low-carb diet and intermittent fasting. And of all of those, there was one thing that has made me different from them, and in fact, it's still pretty much true today, even though there's a lot more low-carb influencers these days. So what is the one difference that often distinguishes between me and them? Well, it's not because I'm brighter than anybody. There's a lot of bright minds out there and sharp guys and people that know more about diabetes than I do. But the one thing that made me different from most was my constant hammering on the theme of using your glucose meter to craft a diet that works for you, to confirm what they're telling you. A lot of them, their attitude is, you just take what I say, and you believe it, you swallow it, you ingest it, and accept it, and embrace it, and you'll be fine. And in many cases, what they're saying is right. I'm in agreement with them, but it's like you're missing out when you don't tell people to use a glucose meter. There's one lady who is kind of into the low carb and often talks about the importance of minimizing spikes and often talks about the importance of food order. And she did a YouTube video recently with the title, "I'm Breaking My Silence About Glucose Meters." And I thought, why are you breaking your silence? Why were you silent in the first place? Why haven't you been talking about it all along as though, well, I've been going on for a couple of years now and telling you how to do it, but I'm going to finally talk about glucose meters. Why would you wait? I don't get that. But then that's just me. There is one lady that does talk about glucose meters a lot, and she basically has the same philosophy that I do, which is you test your blood sugar and you find out which meals work for you and which don't. And I mean, she and I are almost on the same page in a lot of respects. And it is this lady here. Her name is Jenny Rule. She wrote this book, Blood Sugar 101, What They Don't Tell You About Diabetes. And she and I think alike. She strongly emphasizes using your glucose meter to check your meals, check your foods, find out what they're doing to you. Let me just share a couple of quotes from her book. Now it's time to face an important fact. It is the carbohydrates you eat that raise your blood sugar after meals. Sugars and starches. Nothing else. The fats you eat do not raise your blood sugar at all. She goes on to say, well, technically the proteins can raise it, but for most people, they'll never even notice it because it's such a slow process. Their pancreas can keep up with it. So she's basically saying carbs raise your blood sugar. Well, you say, okay, if that's true, why do I need to test my blood sugar? Because a lot of times when you're just starting out, and I'm not talking about you veterans right now, the people that have been testing your blood sugar and you know the difference between a carbohydrate and a protein and a fat, and you know that fruits are loaded with sugar. You know all the right stuff. This isn't going to be news to you, but some of you newly diagnosed diabetics, you've got a lot to learn. And that was the truth for me. One other quote I wanted to share, she says, this is what the 5% Club calls eating to your meter. I got that phrase from her, eating to your meter. In other words, making sure that your meal does not offend your glucose meter, or if you're wearing a CGM, your CGM. You're eating to the meter. You're eating to please the meter, not to please some YouTube influencer, not to please some doctor or some nurse or some nutritionist. You're eating to see what your meter will say about that particular meal or food. And she talks about some man, she says, Alan S. calls this a low-spike diet rather than a low-carbohydrate diet. And you've heard me say that if you watch very many of my videos, and have to plead guilty. This is where I got that idea, a low-spike diet. She says no matter how many grams they are eating, the result is the same. 1 hour post-meal blood sugars under 140 milligrams per deciliter. So what she really says is don't worry so much about the grams. Worry about where does your spike leaves you. And she says a good place to start is about an hour after you finish your meal. You take your last bite and you set the timer for an hour or an hour and 15 minutes and see where that goes and compare different foods that way. So eating to the meter, Jenny Rule, very big on that. She and I think very much alike, but for most of the others, they don't think that way. And they'll just say, here's what you do, here's what you don't do, here's what you eat, here's what you don't eat, and just trust me. And some of them are exactly right. But I like to have it confirmed with some real data. So let me talk for just a couple of minutes about my early struggles. In my early days, when diabetes was trying to come at me like a roaring lion, my blood sugar was bouncing all over the place. It was jumping way too high after meals, often over 200, or at least sometimes over 200. And then sometimes it could drop down to 60 or 50 or 40 about 3 or 4 hours later. So way too high at the beginning, way too low later on, just bouncing all over the place. I was so scared because as I got low, when I was bouncing too high, I felt pretty fine. That was not really so much a problem in terms of how I felt. But when it dropped down to 50 and 40, I had times where I felt like I was going to pass out. One time I actually did pass out in church, of all places. And so I got nervous, and for a while I was eating food every couple of hours just to make sure I didn't faint, didn't pass out. And I had my own little snack bag. I took a sandwich bag, and I took one piece of whole wheat bread, smeared a bunch of peanut butter on it, rolled it up one time, stuck it in the bag, and stuck it in my pocket. And about halfway between breakfast and lunch, or halfway between lunch and dinner, I'd pull out my little sandwich if I was out. If I was home, I could just fix myself something. But if I was out, I'd pull out my little bag and eat my piece of bread with a lot of peanut butter smeared on it. And then I could relax, and it's like, okay, I won't pass out during this period. And I remember one time where I was traveling and I was invited to preach at a church, and they wanted me to come there early and then go through 1 or 2 services, and I wasn't going to get out and get to eat till about 1 o'clock. So it's like from 8 till 1. I was nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof to think I had to go that long. And obviously when you're at church preaching or teaching or talking to people, you can't pull out your little bag and take out your peanut butter and on bread and eat it in the middle of all that. And I was worried. And one of the thoughts I had is, Dennis, you can never fast again because you can barely go 3 hours without your blood sugar dropping like crazy. You can not even make it 3 hours. The idea of you fasting an entire day, you'll never do it again. And that bothered me because as a Christian, that's one of the things I did. One of the tools of my trade, you might say, was to fast and spend extra time in prayer and in the Word of God. And I thought, I can never fast again. But when I got hold of a glucose meter and started checking my numbers, and I found out that it was like an hour after eating, it jumped way up, and 3 to 4 hours after that meal, it plummeted quite low. And I realized that when it got really low, that's when I was about to pass out. I had a thought hit me. If it's the high carbs that are making it go up so high and then drop down so low, maybe if I don't eat so many carbs at a meal, it won't go too high and it won't drop down too low. And as I studied and researched and took a lot of blood sugar tests using, nobody heard of a CGM in those days, 2002, I became more confident of this. And I'll never forget something. I want to read a quote from Dr. Robert Atkins' book, New Diet Revolution. This hit me like a ton of bricks. And when I read it, it's going to be so simple. You're going to think, well, duh, of course. But for me, it was revolutionary. For me, it was like the light bulb went on over my head. Here's what Atkins said. Again, this is absolute simplicity. But for me, it was awesome. He said, your blood glucose level doesn't sharply rise and fall when you sit down to eat a Cobb salad, but it does just that when you chow down a slice of pie. And I think the words that really grabbed me were rise and fall. He said, your blood sugar doesn't rise and fall like crazy when you eat a salad without much carbs to it. But if you have some pie, boom, you're going to get the rise, you're going to get the fall. Well, that was my whole problem. It was rising and falling. My blood sugar was going crazy. And it was like, aha. So what I began to do was eat lower and lower and lower carb meals. Now, I wasn't as low in those days as I am today. I've gotten more strict and a little bit more fanatical. But for me, it was pretty low. All sugar was gone. Most of the starches were gone. And if I did have some kind of a starchy thing like some breakfast cereal, which I did once in a while because I just loved it so much, it was hard to break free from that habit. But I would have a small bowl instead of a big bowl. And lo and behold, exactly what Atkins said became the case for me. Because I ate more salads and meat and steak and less carbs and less sugars and less starches, it didn't get up very high. And it didn't go very low. And I found I could make it from 8 until 1, 8 a.m. till 1 p.m., no problemo. I could easily do that, and my blood sugar wasn't very high and it wasn't very low. It was just beautifully stable. Let me say it again. My blood sugar was beautifully stable, and yours can be as well, my friend. And you know what I found out? I can fast after all. I can fast from morning until 1. Typically, that's pretty much what I do, except that I have the bulletproof coffee in the morning. But no real food to munch on and definitely no carbs until I have my lunch, and then it's still low carb. I found I could fast 4 hours, 6 hours, and I started relaxing. I don't have to worry. I'm not going to faint today. I'm not going to pass out. I'm not going to even come close to passing out. And then I found I could fast an entire day. And eventually I started fasting as much as 36 hours. That's pretty much the limit. Not because I'm afraid I'll pass out. That's just about how far I care to go these days without food. I could do it after all because I wasn't provoking my blood, I wasn't provoking my blood sugar to go up very high, and my pancreas wasn't dumping out loads of insulin to drive it too low, and all was well. Well, let me repeat that statement we got from Ginny Rule, eating to the meter. You know, in sports, there's always going to be one or more umpires or referees, usually multiple referees. But they have to be. Imagine seeing a couple of basketball teams playing against each other and there's not a ref to be found. They're just on their own. Nobody's going to call a foul. Nobody's going to care if you dribble out of bounds and dribble back in. It's just whatever you want to do. It would be chaos. Nobody would want to come and watch that basketball game. It's too crazy. Imagine a soccer game with no referee, a baseball game, a football game with no referee. It would be absurd. You have to have referees. In life, you have to have referees. The ultimate referee is God himself and his word. But when it comes to diabetes, the referee is Mike the glucose meter. He'll tell you if you've gone out of bounds or if you've stayed in bounds. If you've double dribbled, he'll tell you. If you're eating a meal that is not going to provoke a great sharp glucose spike, he'll tell you you've done very well, my friend. And one of the reasons why I'm so different from most of the influencers that speak about low-carb diets is not because we're recommending different things. We're pretty much on the same page with our recommended diet. But the difference is, I will tell you, you need Mike the meter. You need your glucose meter to tell you what's right and what's wrong. Not only will he give you loads of information, and you'll get that in about the first 6 months. After 6 months, you'll pretty well know what Mike's going to say about different meals and different foods. He'll give you the information you need to craft the diet you need to beat and reverse diabetes. But he'll go a step beyond that, my friend. He'll not only tell you what to eat and what not to eat, he'll give you the motivation to eat what you need to eat. Not just information, but motivation. When you look at that glucose meter an hour after you've had that big old meal, and because it's a low-carb meal, it barely rose at all. It was at 98 and now it's at 109, and you're like, well, that's not much of a spike. You get so excited. I do. You get so enthused. You're like, I'm going to eat that meal again. But if you try a meal and it's got too many carbs and sugars in it, and you started out at 98 and now you're at 225, you're like, yuck, what in the world? I'll never eat that meal again as long as I live. Motivation suddenly just explodes within you. And, for the problem with many diabetics isn't really that they're so ignorant they don't have any idea how to eat. It won't take long. You could watch about 5, 10 of my videos if you watch the right ones, and you'd have it pretty well figured out. What do I eat? What don't I eat? But you need something more than just the knowledge of what to eat, what not to eat. You need the motivation to carry through and eat the way you should. Your glucose meter will do that. So to the rest of my brothers and sisters in the low-carb movement who are preaching low-carb and preaching intermittent fasting and telling you to watch those spikes, I say, hooray, you're doing well, my friends. I'm right there with you. But if they're not telling you to test your glucose with a glucose meter or a CGM and they're just ignoring that, I say, shame on you. You haven't given them all the ammunition, all the tools, all the weapons they need to fix their diabetes and stay with it. Because you not only want to beat diabetes, you want to keep it under your feet the rest of your days. If this video has been a blessing to you, there's a very simple way to show your appreciation. How about giving it a like and maybe sharing it with somebody else? YouTube will notice this and they'll promote it to others.